In this chapter, we're going to examine research ethics, or what makes right practice within research. So when we think about science, we recognize the many benefits that it provides and has provided to our health and well-being. And so we'll read this definition that you're already familiar with. So science is that systematic collection and analysis of objective data, that is, data that looks the same no matter who is looking at it, for the purpose of understanding and describing the world around us, explaining cause-effect relationships, predicting likely outcomes in given situations, and optimizing conditions for people, creatures, and the earth. But we ask this question: under what conditions can we ethically acquire data? At what times do the benefits of answering a particular question pose too great a cost to the individuals providing the data? So here is an example. Imagine that an epidemiologist, someone who studies large-scale health issues, wanted to know about the effects of the pandemic on Navajo people so that the community can better meet their needs if there's a future event. This is an example of an applied science question designed to describe a situation for the purpose of optimizing life. So she created a survey and conducted interviews with hundreds of Navajo people of all ages. Unbeknownst to her, elderly people responding to the survey felt frightened afterward because of cultural taboos about talking about illness. And some of these people became so concerned that they could no longer sleep and developed anxiety. From this study, she was able to identify a range of factors that would help the Navajo people bear the difficulties of the pandemic with better health. So she learned a lot about what things would have helped. And so through that, she began the process of facilitating a transition within the Navajo Nation so that they're better prepared next time and can address these needs that they just learned about. So we have a survey, a method, we have ill effects, and we have, in the third bullet point, the benefits of helping the entire Navajo Nation better prepare for a pandemic should one occur again. The question we ask: was the cost to participants, and specifically the cost to those elders who developed anxiety because of violating the taboo, was that worth the scientific benefits? Now, I don't have an answer to this question, but we now have committees at every institution that evaluate this question before any research can move forward. Let's look at another example. Social rejection. A psychologist wanted to better understand the effects of social rejection on rejected teens to determine whether kind of social rejection tends to play a role in acts of violence. And so to do this, he used an experimental method. And he used teens as his participants, and he asked the teens who were the research subjects to play a ball game called Cyberball. And it's just a game of catch on the computer with 3 other virtual people who have been generated. So you don't really see actual people, and the teens participating are alone in a little office on the computer playing this ball game. Now, in some cases, when the teen was sitting in the office, the other players in the game had been programmed to stop throwing the ball to that particular teen who was the research subject after 2 throws. So after 2 throws, nobody throws the ball to him or her anymore, and they just keep on playing without it. In some other cases, the other players in the game don't do that. They just throw the ball to each player an equal number of times. And so that's it. That's all that was done. But through that, the experimenter could measure all kinds of things. So during and after the game, he recorded observable reactions. After the game, he measured the feelings and beliefs that were produced by the rejection. So he regardless of the condition, he asked them to talk about their feelings at that time and to talk about any beliefs they had about themselves or others. And then he observed whether they were willing to help a stranger in need who appeared at the door, and whether they would treat a losing opponent kindly or cruelly. So he had a lot of ways to measure the impacts of whether the teens were rejected or not. And he found that those teens who were rejected in the cyberball game had greater anger, lower self-esteem, feelings of a lack of belongingness, a loss of identity, and a sense of resignation or giving up. Additionally, they were less likely to help the stranger in need who appeared at the door and were more likely to treat an opponent cruelly, and that is those teens who had been rejected. The same did not occur for the participants who were given equal turns with the ball, so there was a difference depending on whether the teens had been rejected. And the benefits of this work have been pronounced through these discoveries about the pain of rejection. More work ensued. There was quite a bit of work on this, and it led in the end to greater attention to social dynamics in the schools and social skills teaching as a larger focus of curriculum and even books that come out for children. So he turned our eye to a problem that might be contributing to school violence. So this is the question. Was the cost to participants, and in particular, those participants who were teens who had been rejected and suffered all those bad feelings and ill effects, was that cost worth the benefits? So once again, this is the question that we are exploring in this particular class. This is the question that the review committees at institutions have to consider. And so to get to an understanding of these ethical conundrums that face scientists, we're going to examine questions like the ones we just did. And we're going to explore the history of ethical practices that are mandated within science today to prevent harm to participants. So when you're done here, you'll have a sense of the history of unethical research, the moral foundations of ethical research. We'll look at how those moral foundations or principles led to an ethical code, and then how that ethical code actually plays out in institutions. Then we'll give special considerations for Native peoples and have some more examples. So a number of studies took place that may surprise or disturb you. And as you listen to these studies, think about whether how fairly you think the participants were treated, whether the researcher was acting with integrity, how much the researcher was considering the rights of the people involved in the studies, and about whether the risks were greater than the benefits or the benefits were greater than the risks. So in 1939, Wendell Johnson and Mary Tudor conducted a stuttering experiment on 22 orphan children in Davenport, Iowa. They were separated into two groups. The first received positive speech therapy, where children were praised for speech fluency. And in the second group, children received negative speech therapy and were belittled for every speech imperfection. Normal speaking children in the second group developed speech problems, which they then retained for the rest of their lives. So they took the biggest problems with this. Well, there are so many problems. That first off, the belittling caused harm to children. That right there is a problem, and the benefits might not have exceeded the risks. But secondly, this really took advantage of a vulnerable population. First, children who can't advocate for themselves, and second, orphan children who didn't have any parents looking after them. So these children already had the worst possible circumstances, and these researchers took advantage of that vulnerability to test a hypothesis. So I will let you read these. It feels a little silly for me to read these to you, but after you read this, you'll see that the subjects in the study were prison inmates, and they were offered the suggestion that they might get parole and cash, two things that they were sadly in need of. And because of those strong compensation, they agreed to participate in studies that they probably didn't fully understand. And that is, they were exposed to excessive levels of radiation in 10-minute intervals, and to the testicles, which would harm their reproductive capacity or their sperm development. And so they were not told how dangerous this was, and they were a vulnerable population. So a double whammy set of risks there. So once again, I'm not going to read this to you. You can pause and read it to yourself. But in a nutshell, this radiation thing was a big deal because the first bombs had gone off in Japan, and there were enormous harm to the people who didn't die but were exposed to radiation. So they really needed to learn more about it because this was going to be a possible risk in our world. So there was a value to learning about radiation. However, look who they chose here: pregnant women. And the fetuses of those women were extremely vulnerable, and the women themselves were vulnerable because they were told that these drinks that they were given were vitamin drinks, and instead the drinks contained radioactive iron. And they were wondering how it would cross the placenta and affect the developing fetus. And you can see that 7 of the babies later died, and the women themselves died, or experienced bad effects, cancer, anemia, rashes, bruises, and so forth. And so this was another situation where a very vulnerable population was targeted, and the consequences were serious and life-threatening. So there again, we have a questionable research study. This one is an interesting one. Take a moment to read it. And you'll see that they were interested in, again, we're looking at this post-World War II time where this is a pretty scary situation. So they were trying to imagine all of the possible types of war that could be conducted. And here we have an example of infected mosquitoes released into 2 cities to see if the mosquitoes could spread yellow fever and dengue fever. And it's important to know these things, but in this way, by exposing them into 2 cities, and you can see that the researchers themselves contracted some illnesses. And then there was a deception because Army researchers pretended to be public health workers to photograph what happened. And so this was pretty unethical. People were exposed to this without being told anything about it. And that's a very unethical approach to research. Here you can read, but you'll see that you know maybe what boot camp is. It's a pretty intense 8-week period where young military people are exposed to really hard conditions, really tough physical workout, early rising, you know, a lot of physical and psychological challenging time, and to get through boot camp and become actually a soldier. And right at that point, 17 and 18-year-old boys who left home probably for the first time and anticipated going to war, well, they were offered an opportunity to participate in an experiment that would help shorten the war just after this boot camp. And they weren't told that it would involve mustard gas, which caused severe internal and external burns. And not only that, but after they did this to these young men, they kind of denied responsibility. And the boys weren't supported as they could have been. And you can see the agony that these young men are likely in. And so this was quite a contribution by these young men to help us learn more about the effects of mustard gas. But this was extremely unfair to the way in which this was done, and I don't even need to explain. I think the unfairness, the lack of justice, will be very obvious to you. And one of the most famous, do take time to read this, is the Tuskegee syphilis study. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease that's fairly serious and can even kill victims. And so it's good to learn about this disease. But the way they chose to do it was to get 600 poor, first challenge, illiterate, they can't read, second challenge, male sharecroppers, very poor, who were hired, quote unquote, in Macon County, Alabama. And not even all of them had contracted syphilis before. And none of them were told that they had a life-threatening disease. So instead, they were told that they were just getting free health care, meals, burial insurance if they participated. And so they were just, what the participation was they were going to watch these men with syphilis and not say anything to them about this disease and just watch what happens when you let people walk around with a deadly disease. So naturally, they exposed other people. Their wives got the disease. Their children were born with congenital syphilis. And making matters worse, by 1947, they discovered that penicillin could treat syphilis, and they didn't give them the treatment. So they just let them continue on infecting people and dying. And this one participants were given a public apology. Not that that helps that much, but at least it's acknowledged by the US government that this was an enormous violation. So this is a video about that I'll invite you to watch on your own time. I can't embed it because of copyright. And then the other big critical tipping point was Nazi experimentation in the World War II. And so the Nazis would take people that they had captured and do just very many cruel, horrific experiments, sometimes just to say, what would happen if, you know, and so very, not any benefits necessarily touted or anything. And of course, most cases, the participants died or were disfigured or permanently disabled. They tried genetic manipulation on twins. They tried to transplant bones, muscle, and nerves. They exposed people to diseases. They sterilized anything they could think of. And so these two were formally acknowledged, and a trial was held afterwards for these doctors. And that will lead to the development of the Nuremberg Code that's talked about in the next lecture. So some examples to think about. Is it ethical? A researcher receives money from a drug company to test a new medicine, and that new medicine could make a lot of money for the company. We could have a potential ethical violation here in that the researcher might be highly motivated to produce results that support the medicine because there's money behind it. A college vice president, who's a powerful position, asks a professor, also a powerful position, to give his students bonus points to participate in a study of a new program the university is trying. So we have kind of a double power play here. The vice president asks the professor, well, how does the professor say no? That's his boss. And then the professor has to ask his students and give them bonus points. And so that's a double whammy in that people are feeling coerced to participate. A doctor, well-respected doctor, suggests to his patients with cancer that they take part in clinical trials for an experimental treatment for a medicine he himself is trying to patent. So this could be a good medicine, and this doctor could really care about his patients. But the doctor is in a power position as the expert. Patients with cancer are very vulnerable, and so they may take part when they might not otherwise do so, simply because the doctor is suggesting it and they are vulnerable. And the problem here isn't, it's that he's trying to patent it himself, which means he could make money off it. So then we have that ulterior motivation that's possible, and that's where he needs to step back. And this last example, a school buys a new reading program and randomly assigns some classrooms to use it and others to use a really outdated old program because they want to see the difference. And the challenge here relates to justice, in that what about the children who have to use the old program? Is the opportunity to learn better being withheld from them? And so if this really is a good program, the researchers need to make it possible for children in both groups to benefit from the new program. And a design approach called counterbalancing can help with that. All right, on to the next section.